Thank you all very much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here this afternoon. I'm Damien Radcliffe. I'm the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor in Journalism here at the SOJC. And I also curate and host the Demystifying media series of which the talk today is a part. The Demystifying series gives us an opportunity to bring in fantastic external speakers who are really kind of pushing the boundaries of our knowledge and understanding of how communications technology is being used. If you want a hashtag or a tweet from today's event, and I've written it down here, please use hashtag Demystify. And if you're here for extra credit, there are sign-in sheets at the front. If you haven't already put your name down on the way in, please make sure you do so on the way out. Our guest today is Zach Hyder, who's a partner, lead strategist, brand specialist and creative manager for Quinn Thomas in Portland. Zach has managed communications campaigns for Nike, AT&T, Daimler, Intel, and the University of Oregon, as well as a wide range of different government agencies. Prior to that, he worked for a long time at Fleischmann Hillard, and also as a public affairs advisor in Washington, D.C. Towards the end of last year, Quinn Thomas published an extensive report exploring the role that social media plays in shaping opinions about current events, electoral politics, and policy here in the Pacific Northwest. And I think what's really interesting about that research is that typically a lot of the material we see about social media looks at America and the US as a whole. And this really was the first time I'd seen an extensive dive into what was happening in our own backyard. And it's really important for us here in the SOJC to try and understand what's happening in our patch and how social is influencing the kind of news and information that people have access to, and indeed how they think it can influence and shape the world around them. So without further ado, hand you over to Zach.
Great, thank you, Damien. How's everybody doing? 3 o'clock on a Friday? Wow, I thought there were going to be 4 people that showed, and that was probably being generous. Well, really a pleasure to be here and to see a lot of folks that are obviously interested in a really interesting, and I think it goes without saying, really complex topic. So you see a PowerPoint in front of you. Do not worry. This is not going to be a long lecture. In fact, I'm going to try to make this as conversational as possible because I think legitimately one of the things that we were interested in is trying to look at some of the debate that happens within the effectiveness and the influence that we often see or sometimes we perceive in terms of how social media is really influencing our discourse. Does everybody know what I mean when I talk about discourse? Anyone? Who wants to tell me what I mean when I talk about public discourse? Come on. I'm going to call on someone. Anyone? I knew you were. Well, only because you were part of the lunch earlier, so I felt like it was a friendly face. Yes. No. So Lauren, what do you think we mean by public discourse?
I don't know. I guess I kind of think of like what people are doing in like their area that they're interested in.
Okay. So the context of discourse is multifaceted, but really what we're sort of talking about is what people are talking about. It could be politics. It could be social issues like marriage equality. It could be racial issues, things that are happening around poverty, homelessness. That is our sort of shared public discourse. And I'm sure a lot of you probably, if you're on Facebook, Twitter, lots of different social media platforms, you probably frequently see discussions, commentary, news stories, things that come across your feed, right? So what we were really interested in looking at is how much does what all of us out there in the broader universe, how much does what we see coming through our channels, which are really personalized, how much does it influence our perceptions of those issues? How much does it shape our opinions? How much does it sort of shape our engagement in the discourse around those issues? So let me start by just reading a statement. So social media is a positive force in our shared public discourse. It opens up our halls of democracy. It ensures greater access and transparency. It allows for more diverse viewpoints to be heard. It holds institutions accountable. It has transformed civic engagement for the better. Raise your hand if you agree with this statement. Come on. I know it's 3 o'clock on a Friday, but I can see. All right. So who wants to tell me why they agree with this statement? Who had their hand up? You had your hand up.
I mean, I partially agree with it, but I mean, it opens up just with the massive amounts of information, particularly like on platforms like Twitter, that can be communicated at any moment in time. I think that sometimes it does more harm in some cases, but ultimately does like very much good in communicating, things like breaking news and what's happening and what's going on, and just being perfectly transparent with your audience and connecting with them on that level.
Does it hold institutions accountable? And by institutions, I mean government, elected officials, journalists, media institutions, media outlets. Does it do a good job of holding those institutions accountable for accuracy and facts?
Yes.
It does? Okay. So there's a lot to agree with in this statement. Let me read a different statement. Social media has a negative effect on our public discourse. It elevates opinion, rumor, and emotion over facts. It promotes surface-level debate instead of thoughtful discussion. It allows us to filter out views and opinions we disagree with. This has weakened the quality of journalism, and as such, our public discourse is worse. Raise your hand if you agree with this statement. Okay, tell me why you agree with this statement.
Who? Me?
Yes, you.
Because of internet, with internet, it's like everybody reads whatever's on it and then immediately believes it. There's a lot of naiveness associated with it, and also like witch hunts. People get into witch hunts. You think about back to the Boston Marathon bombing. If I'm not correct on Reddit, there was a huge witch hunt, thinking that, oh, we found the guy, when actually completely innocent bystander, not even involved. It just, you have people sitting behind their computers completely anonymous, and they're just trolling. That's all. And so that's the one thing that people and also news has to be careful about is, how can I put this? Thinking about what they're reading and basically doing what we're taught to do, which is, okay, where are these facts coming from? Are these facts actually the real facts, or are they not accurate? Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to agree with in this statement, right? It does have a rapidity to it that makes things move so fast that oftentimes there's a failure to stop and check the accuracy of information and facts. There's the pile-on effect. We're all familiar with that. We've all seen a lot of, elected officials, a lot of companies have to come out and do the apology because something was said too quickly or something was said out of context. In my line of work as a strategic communications consultant, we have good company of lots of friends of ours that have, been removed from positions in companies because of things that were mismanaged on social media, which leads to media outcry, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, does that, elevate debate? Does it lead to better discourse? Are people really engaging in democracy better if what they're seeing is surface level, right? So the two statements here are intended to draw sort of a juxtaposition, because we have a tendency to sort of, especially in the reporting that we see, if you just scan the headlines on what's been happening in our sort of world of media consumption, it's social media great, social media amazing, taking over the universe, social media bad, It's very like caveman-esque, right? Good, bad. So we have a tendency to sort of go into these two camps. What we were really interested in trying to do is say, look, yes, but there's a lot of complexity in the middle. There's a lot of issues that oftentimes are both good and bad. So we wanted to sort of, try to have some analysis, really at the local level, here in Oregon and around the Pacific Northwest, by doing some research, to understand where does the public sort of position it in their minds? How do they value what they see? How effective is what they see on social media in terms of changing their opinions? So let's just think about some visuals for a second. Going back to social media good, social media bad. Is social media good if you're an Egyptian citizen, right? In an environment or in a society in which media is very controlled, and you are a pro-democracy demonstrator that is wanting to have your voice heard, that wants to be a part of a movement to overthrow a corrupt, what you perceive as a corrupt government. Social media good in that context? Right. Does it still, however, lead to misinformation? Yes, right? So again, both. Ice Bucket Challenge. You guys are all familiar with this? Does social media, elevate important awareness of important issues and diseases? Can anybody tell me what the Ice Bucket Challenge was for, by the way? ALS. Wow, smart group. I've asked that question before and I've gotten blank stares. But that was one of the reasons that Ice Bucket Challenge got criticized after several months was, yes, it raised awareness of ALS in certain circles. Yes, it helped raise money. But did everybody that took a video of themselves dumping water on their heads, did every one of them know what it was for? Did every one of them donate? No, right? So again, social media good, social media bad, but it's more complex than that. Obviously, politics, no question, social media is playing a huge role. It's funny because we oftentimes, I think, end up seeing the political use of social media through the lens of like what we have with our buddy Marco here. It's the sort of the selfie, the experience, the sort of new version of the autograph. But yeah, it plays a huge role in what's happening on the national stage, but it also plays a huge role in informing what's happening at City Hall, what's happening at City Council, what's happening at the local government level in terms of what's happening in our halls of democracy. If you're an African American in this country, in this state, does social media play an important role in raising awareness of discrimination? Yep. Police violence? Right? And there are some that will say, but does social media always end up telling the whole story of what happens between law enforcement and a citizen, regardless of the color of their skin? So again, a context of where sometimes we end up skimming the surface, but then at the same time, and I'm going to show some clips from focus groups that we did as part of this research. But one of the sort of standout moments in a focus group that we did up in Portland last year on this issue was a woman that said, I had heard about racial profiling. I'd heard about law enforcement discriminating against non-white citizens. I'd heard about it. People had told me their opinions. People had told me that they'd been profiled. But I never believed it until I saw the video myself that was posted on Facebook, that my friends shared, that I saw on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it does a lot, right? And then, of course, you have the Pope coming to town. We all have to make sure we get our photo to show our friends we were there, right? There's a really great meme that's going around the internet, and it's this old woman when the Pope came to the United States, and there's this throng of people as he's going by in his little scooter, whatever that thing is. And she's the only person, and she's just leaning, and she's just admiring the Pope, and there's this crowd around her, all with their phones. And it just says, for her generation, you didn't need to take a picture to experience the moment, right? So we have a way of sort of expressing our involvement with national events, global events, important spokespeople from around the world that we experience, celebrities, whatever you want to call it. It's our way of sort of being part of the news and proving to ourselves and others that we were there. And then you have the guys down in Harney County. This is one of the next great case studies, I think, in terms of did they use social media effectively? In some instances. Did they do a good job of controlling the story? Depends on who you ask. Depends on the audience that they were talking to. If you're a center-right voter that really hates the federal government, they probably did a great job. But if you're an Oregonian that just knows a bunch of outsiders came into the state of Oregon and took over a compound down in Burns, Oregon, you're probably not thinking they did such a good job of using Facebook and YouTube and other channels to sort of control the message. We're certainly seeing it in terms of how news gets reported. For those of you with eyesight like mine, not so great. This is actually a White House press conference. So you've got the New York Times photographer, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post photographer, whoever he is. And you've got this woman who's live streaming it through Periscope, right? It's definitely changing how news gets reported. So here's the thing. All of this has a tendency to look at the quantity, right, of where social media is all of a sudden, it's in our everyday lives, we see it everywhere. Adoption's gone up. And this is one of the challenges that when we first started this report, that we said, everybody, we get asked to give a lot of, presentations, we get asked to do a lot of, strategic plans for clients. And a lot of them focus on who's using what. How many people are on Facebook? Wait, so aren't old people on Facebook more and young people are not on Facebook? And what do young people use now? And it's all this data. That is absolutely important, no question. So if you just look at the trajectory, yes, we're reaching a saturation point where it's starting to kind of level off. Will we ever fully reach 100%? I don't know. But we're, in the mid-70s in terms of, national adoption of social media channels. And then, of course, meanwhile, readership of newspapers is going way down. And this is for every age group, right? So you look down here, it's not just you young folks. Even the old-timers like me are not reading newspapers like they used to. But then that forces us to ask the question, what is reading a newspaper? Does anybody here get a newspaper? Raise your hand if you get a physical newspaper delivered to you. Oh, okay, I see my peers in the room raising their hands. This is terrible. Does anybody here that's a student actually get a physical newspaper? Couple? Why? I'm really curious. Why do you get a physical newspaper?
Good question. Well, we live in a house with like 60 other people, so that's kind of a way we get news.
Okay.
And people actually read the newspaper
Okay.
every day. Very dedicated. Yeah.
So you're screwing up the circulation numbers. It's one paper for 60 people. All right, so how do the rest of you read the news? Let's just call it the news. How do you get your news on a daily basis? Where do you get it from? Yes?
I have are you pointing at me?
I'm pointing at you. I was acknowledging he was also saying something too, but go ahead.
I have the e-edition for the register guard, so I just have like the online version.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the same or different.
Do you do it on your desktop, your phone, tablet?
Usually the computer, sometimes on my phone too.
Are you going directly to the website?
Yes.
Okay, so you're not getting it through a filter.
I have that too.
Okay, all right.
But yeah, no, I can do both ways.
And sir, you were starting to say something, I believe, down here.
Oh yeah, they're just like the news apps. Like New York Times, BBC, Reuters, they all have their own applications with free articles on them.
Okay.
Same. I receive notifications like Fox News alerts, and like whenever I see something that interests me, then I'll go to the app and I'll look at it. But yeah, I receive.
Okay, right. So here's one of the great issues that oftentimes we see, which is there's a perception that nobody reads the news anymore, and the truth is that's really not true. It's the disparateness now of where that news is coming from, and this is actually one of the things we really wanted to look at in our report. Was people will say, well, they don't read the newspaper, but does that mean that folks aren't reading the news at all? And if they are they getting it through social media? That was a question we really wanted to try and understand. Was Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, for all demographics, regardless of age, gender, race, is it where people actually get news and information? So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but let's just take a quick look at a snapshot of kind of where the Pacific Northwest is. So those national, the chart I just showed you, those are the national data trends. We're a little above average here in the Pacific Northwest. We're at about 80% adoption. 19% say they do not use any kind of social media. And I would love to know who these people are. I have yet to figure this out, but there's 1% out there in a survey size of 1,500 people that we surveyed that said they didn't know what social media was. So they've obviously been living under a rock. So here's an interesting statistic. So again, I think one of my challenges to you folks here today would be to say, when you see those graphs, when you pick up the Fast Company or the Wired magazine or the Wall Street Journal, whatever it is, and you see this data, make sure you stop and question, okay, say that's great, right? 80% of the population in Oregon or X% nationally is using social media. But one of the things that's interesting is we have the ability in sort of going out and doing our polling to crosstab this. So we isolated the 80% that said yes. And so everything I'm going to talk about now going forward are responses, perceptions, beliefs, values, et cetera, of those 80% in Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and Washington State that said yes to this question. One of the things we asked was, well, how often do you use it? Almost 30% of that 80% said, I almost never use it. Or when I do use it, it's rare, it's infrequent. Like, I have a lot of friends, I have a lot of peers in my age group that say, I have a Facebook account, but I just spy on people. I just look at what everybody else is doing, but I don't engage. And I don't do it very frequently, once a week, maybe once a month, right? So make sure that we look beyond the headline of everybody's using social media and say, yes, but how frequently, how much, why are they using it? That's a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about as we go through this. So the most important reason, right, we were very curious to know why people were using it. Were they using it for news? Were they using it to sort of get information because they're not reading newspapers, as we've established? Number one reason is social, right? There's a reason they call it social media. And it's to connect with your friends. It's the personal connections, followed by a distant second of news and information. Now, this is a difficult question because you'll notice we said, what is the most important reason, right? That doesn't mean that people aren't getting news from Facebook, Twitter, etc. But it's not the most important reason why they're using it. That will certainly shift, right? Everything I'm talking about today is a snapshot in time. And these companies, right, Facebook, these are big monolithic media companies in and of themselves. They're getting very smart about learning how to integrate news and information. You've probably seen this in your own feeds as you're beginning to get more news filtered through your different channels. So the question that we were constantly focused on in our work isn't the quantity of social media use, isn't what social media is being used for, but how influential is social media in shaping public opinion? This is really the key question that we asked. There's a really excellent researcher who works for the Pew Center in DC. I really encourage you to go read her stuff because she's one of the foremost experts on really what's happening at the intersection between journalism, news, and digital technology, and that includes social media, mobile platform adoption, et cetera. And it was interesting because in doing a lot of the secondary literature review for our study, I came across something because we were constantly banging our heads against a wall and saying, okay, but we don't know so much because we can't tell what people are seeing because they control their friends. They control who's in their networks. We also can't control what they're clicking on. So we have to have a recognition that there's a limit to what we can really truly understand. So Amy Mitchell, in a recent presentation that she had given not long before we published our study, said the nuances of what we're trying to understand in terms of social media's effectiveness and its influence is really complex. There's algorithms. You're self-selecting who you're getting your information from. So my information is going to be different than your information, which is going to be different than your information because of who is in your network, right? And that's one of the issues we're kind of curious to sort of try and understand. But we're at the infancy. Go back to the chart. When did you see the start of that chart? Was it what year, 2006? 10 years ago? And yet we're constantly being told we should know everything about what's happening and how people are using it and how it's implemented. So we're at the very early stages of trying to truly understand what this technology, what these media really are doing in terms of their impact. Amy just backed us up. So let me talk a little bit about some of the key questions that we looked at in our research. There were really 4 primary things that we were interested in trying to understand. The first is, does social media activity about news and events and political debates, social debates, marriage equality, et cetera, does it actually shape people's opinions and perceptions about those issues? The second is it just an echo chamber where you are told what you want to be told, where your views, your values, your beliefs are just reinforced because your friends tell you the exact same thing and have the exact same opinions, and share the same beliefs. How are they changing, really how are they changing how people are consuming news, right? So we know they're not reading newspapers, but are they actually consuming news and information through social channels? And then lastly, how do they value social media in the context of broader public discourse? Do they have any value on it next to things like voting or volunteering for a campaign or donating to a nonprofit or to a cause? So those are the big issues. So let's start with this first one. Does social media activity about current events, news, political debates, does it actually shape people's opinions about those issues? Anybody, before I start going through numbers, does anybody want to take a stab? Does it? I see some nodding. Yes? No? Anyone? Call on, so I can start calling on people. This enormous power I have up here. I get to call on people. Anyone? Who? Oh, sir. Yes, thank you. Brave soul.
When you look at like the Democratic nomination, you have Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and they have the two comparison photos, and they always pick photos that are just comical. And Bernie's photos are always in tune with our generation, and then Hillary's photos are always portraying her as out of touch with our generation.
Interesting.
Bernie's like the cool candidate.
Very perceptive. I have to do a quick informal poll. This is so selfish. Raise your hand if you're voting for Bernie Sanders. Come on, get them up. Raise your hand. All right, raise your hand if you're voting for Hillary Clinton. Wow, okay. Raise your hand if you're voting for anybody else. Are you voting? Yes? Okay. All right. So yeah, I mean, interesting. So what we see on social media is largely visual, right? We see images, we see pictures, video content, et cetera, et cetera. So that obviously affects our opinions of those people, the news story. So when we asked this question in our research, 26% of respondents said yes. When I see things that my peers, my social network shares, whether it's presidential election or local news story, about things that matter to me, agree or disagree, it does shape my view of that. 26% said they did. 62% said it did not. This is a little bit of a misleading question because there's a really famous saying about advertising. Everybody thinks advertising works, just not on them, right? So are people naturally going to have a tendency to say, no, like what Sally posted on Facebook about marriage equality or police brutality didn't shape my opinion. But we're going to take a listen to actually how it has, in certain instances, helped evolve people's opinions. So let's look at the 26% that said yes. Who were the population groups that said yes, it had? Much more prevalent amongst you young folks. And young folks includes, you'll note, the early 30s. So if there's any early 30s in the room, it's not just the college kids. But compare that to the older demographic, the 55-year-old plus, right? Pretty significant difference. Women compared to men. This, by the way, is something we see in a lot of research. You ever ask a man, did something you saw change your opinion? No. They are just not willing to do it. They're also not willing to go to the doctor. They're not willing to do a lot of things, but done a lot of research, men versus women, and men are stubborn. Now, here's something that we thought was particularly interesting. Again, recognizing our research and our focus was on the Pacific Northwest, right? What is the interesting sort of political demographic fact about the Pacific Northwest? We're a pretty left-of-center region of the country. We are not Texas or Alabama, right? So 31% of Democrats said, yeah, when I see stuff on social media, it does influence my opinion of current events, of news stories, compared to 22% of Republicans and 23% of NAV as non-affiliated voters. So that's independent, capital I, independent, lower I. So, right, are now Democrats just being nice and saying, yeah, I'm so open-minded. Yes, that's, it's Oregon, right? There's a lot to like if you're a Democrat in Pacific Northwest. So that's just kind of a snapshot of the opinion influence question that we asked. So let's look at our next question. Is social media, is it just an echo chamber that reinforces what you already think because your friends all hold the same values and beliefs and opinions about political and social issues. Anyone want to take a guess as to where folks landed on this? What do you think about this? Does social media just tell us what we want to hear?
Well, I think based off who we follow and what we like and those sort of things, those definitely filter us to, be seeing the things that we want to see more so than general. I mean, it can lead to a biased intake of news if you're, only following and only checking in on these certain social media outlets. So I think in that way, it definitely is like a chamber of like-minded ideas. I know on my social media, I feel that. Like,
I was just about to ask. So
yeah.
Do you follow any news organizations, or do you get any news that comes through your feed?
Well, I follow some different like accounts on Twitter that give me news, and I also just scroll through the news section on Twitter. But yeah, I mean, I definitely know that the accounts that I've liked on Facebook and stuff, that's the news that shows up on my news feed oftentimes.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? And anyone think that it doesn't just reinforce what people already think, because we self-select and curate the information we want to get? And isn't that one of the challenges of it, right? I can now subscribe to only the things I want to get information about, right? So if I'm reading only the New York Times or only the alternative magazines, et cetera, I'm only going to hear certain viewpoints. My dad, an interesting story of another generation. My dad was doing his graduate work at UC Berkeley during the Nixon-McGovern election. You guys remember Nixon-McGovern election? Anyone? No? And he just went to bed on election night. Of course McGovern's going to win. Everybody I know is going to vote for McGovern. He's going to be the president of the United States. Woke up the next morning, Nixon wins in a landslide. The story, the moral there is, everybody he knew was voting for McGovern, so how could he possibly not win? We see a lot of the same thing happening in what's happening with our ability to curate and filter information through social media. Are you reinforcing your own belief about who the next president of the United States is going to be? So let's take a look at what folks said. So which viewpoint do you agree with more? Social media only validates people's existing views on issues. Majority said yes to that statement. This is where most people fall. 33% said no, it actually educates, it challenges people on their values, beliefs, opinions. And then there's the don't knows, the 16%. So let's take a look at this right here, the 33% that said no, I think going back to social media good, I think it does help educate and challenge people's views. You're going to see some pretty similar demographic breakdowns here. Young people, overwhelmingly, agree, yes, it helps. Women and Democrats. You see that pretty consistently as far as who says that social media is having an actual influence. So let me actually not just show you data, but let me sort of bring in a person through a focus group that we did that can explain how that might happen, right? Because one of the things we're interested in addition to doing our polling, is saying, all right, so X number of people think this, X number of people think this, but why, right? How is that? So let's take a listen to a clip of someone in one of our focus groups that we did in Portland talk about that question of, does it change my opinion? Does it evolve? Does it shape and educate my view on a certain issue? Let's hear what she has to say.
Think of any examples where you changed your opinion because of things you've seen or read in social media.
I don't know if I've necessarily changed my opinion. I may have changed my view, and what I mean by that is I may have softened my view. I am more of a moderate conservative. It's interesting to read their point of view and kind of mesh it with my point of view, and not so far off that we are completely politically different. But it's been interesting having conversations with them. It's who I'm hearing it from. I've kind of on the marriage equality thing, I come from a very conservative background. But I have friends who have gotten married who are gay. And while I may not fully agree with it, I'm like, you know, and it's part of that acceptance. And yeah, we may not see eye to eye, but I'm happy for you.
It's like it's okay to
And
disagree.
yeah.
So what did you guys hear there? Sorry? I heard a murmur. Boy, you guys are a shy bunch.
I think that she thinks her opinions aren't changed, but they certainly have been influenced heavily.
Yep. Yeah. So one of the things that was an interesting takeaway for us is, we have a tendency in polling, we have a tendency in doing research and looking at a lot of things to say, well, this is where people fall. But again, going back to the good, bad, and recognizing the more interesting parts, kind of the gray space in the middle, effectively what this person said is, she wasn't willing to she was in that 62%. No, it's not changed my opinion, but by being exposed to the views of my gay and lesbian friends and seeing what this meant to them and watching them get married and seeing their photos posted on Facebook and experiencing that joy for them over several years, it has changed my view. It softened my view. Now in a poll, I'm going to say, do I support gay marriage? Whether she will, still to this day, is a question. But recognize that nuance is really important because it has ultimately changed her viewpoint, right? Anybody here done focus groups before? Anyone? One person in the back? Okay. They're fascinating things to do. You get a group of people in a room and you ask them questions and you just continue to let them talk and ask why. So they will say something like, I think this, and you get to kind of ask them why. This was kind of a seminal moment for us because we kept having this conversation about, you're saying this, but you're kind of also saying this. She's like, yeah, it hasn't changed my opinion, but. It was the but that was the big kind of takeaway for us. All right, so how is it changing the ways in which people are consuming news? Going back to our big one. So interestingly, in terms of how social media ranks compared to other news sources, folks said that they still spend less time using social media compared to things like newspapers, local news on the television, talk radio, etc. This was a kind of a significant thing for us because again, newspaper readership going down, everybody must be, digital apps, all that stuff. But people said, going back to our 2 newspaper readers in the room, no, it's not that simple. It's not just that I don't read the newspaper, there's more to it than that, right? So yeah, a lot of folks are saying, yes, more time, but these numbers will change. Keep in mind, this is one snapshot in time. Social media, if you really localize it, social media is how I get news about what's going on in the community. 43% agree. And again, this is a little bit of a different question. It's about what's going on in my community, what's happening at the local level. People are willing to say, yeah, I get more information through what I'm seeing my friends talk about on different channels. Does social media have a greater, the same, or less impact on bringing about change, right? Actually making change happen, laws, etc. Shedding light on corruption compared to traditional journalism. And you'll see, you combine these 2 numbers, greater, the same, people value it. Right? Social media does a lot in their mind to make things happen, which is significant, right? Going back to the question of how do people value it. So which statement, you guys are a room full of journalism students, which statement do you agree with more? Social media has little or no influence in shaping the news, has made no impact on today's journalism. 16% agree with that statement. Social media has a positive influence in shaping the news and has made today's journalism better. 30% agree with that. And watch this. Social media has a negative influence in shaping the news and has made journalism worse. 40%. Why would 40% of people we talk to say it's making journalism worse? Why would they say that? I see a hand. You guys gotta go. Okay, up. Get those arms working, people.
Because a lot of people just post like blog posts or, you know, statuses on Facebook or something without actually like knowing the entire story. And so then it can twist things and people can jump on bandwagons, and so it's not coming from a direct source.
Yep.
And like the story can get totally twisted, and that would be considered negative journalism.
And it's not just people, right? It's reporters. It's editorial boards. It's journalistic institutions, right? I saw another hand.
Yeah, a lot of them are websites are very biased and they're not trusted, but people just read it and kind of like, oh, that makes sense, and then share it, and
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. See another hand?
Yeah, there's already kind of a stigma against social media, especially with like older generations. They kind of view social media as not like a valid form of communication of news, so that might have also like influenced the results.
Yep. Are you guys all familiar with the story of Justine Sacco? Who is Justine? Kevin?
Is that the one who went to Africa on a flight?
Yep.
And tweeted before the plane took off? And then,
What did she tweet?
things I won't repeat, but
Hope she won't get AIDS.
racism.
Yeah. I'm going to South Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. But what did she follow it with? What was the reason she got fired? Do you remember?
She like hashtagged something, I don't know what it was.
She said, just kidding, I'm white. Before she landed in Africa, she had lost her job. She was in every news outlet, New York Times, CNN, she was everywhere. And here's the interesting thing. So over the course of 48 hours, this was a huge news story, right? This was a news story about how dangerous it is to express your opinion on social media because you'll get caught, you'll get fired. It was almost a laugh story, right? This stupid person, and there were all these hashtags that people started. The hashtag that was most popular was, has Justine landed yet? Because everyone couldn't wait for her to land so that, to see how she wanted, she was going to land and realize her phone was going to blow up and she'd been fired and all this stuff. In the aftermath of this, there was a great article, great analysis that was done in the New York Times Magazine that, given the opportunity to sort of articulate what she was talking about, she was able to elevate the fact that she's saying, this is the problem, which is my commentary, which yes, could have been misconstrued, but my commentary was more about the fact that that wasn't true. AIDS is not just an African problem, right? And it's not just a gay, bisexual problem. It is all of our problem. And yet, she was taken at face value because in 140 characters, she made something that people deemed offensive. And it was a huge news story. We lost an opportunity to have a really important discussion about a global epidemic, right? Because we had to, pile on and fire someone. Let's listen to this. This particular topic talked about in one of our focus groups as well.
Let me just make a claim and put it out there as a straw man so people can agree with it, they can disagree with it, but just to get your reaction. Social media has improved journalism because if a journalist puts out bad information, everybody now has a platform to comment, critique, and correct.
I don't think it has changed. Everybody will do as they will.
I don't agree with that. I feel like it...
You do not agree with that?
I don't agree
Okay,
with
cool.
that.
Yeah, why not?
I feel like it becomes sort of like policing and kind of almost obstructing freedom of speech because in the effort of political correctness or being fair, I think we see that a lot nowadays with public figures saying things that are stupid and they probably shouldn't have said, and big nonprofit organizations kind of demanding apologies. And I think that can kind of lead to an environment where people are afraid to speak their mind and afraid to write things that could be radical and helpful to the world.
So what did he say that influence is doing? What was the major tenet of his comment? And I'm sorry if you guys couldn't hear him. I'll translate. That helps.
Obstructing freedom of speech and causing businesses
to cry out for an apology where there might not be one that's needed just because they get all bent out of shape over something said on social media.
Right.
And causing people to, like I said earlier, the obstruction of the freedom of speech, it's like these radical ideals and everybody's jumping on saying no, 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 when really in reality that radical ideal might just help.
Yeah, I mean, it begs the question, does social media obstruct freedom of speech? Does it force us or lead us to censor ourselves, right? Because if Justine can say something, she had, by the way, like 250 followers on Twitter. That's it. And she was a global news story because everyone said, she's a racist. Look at this racist, right? It begs the question, does it lead us to censor ourselves? Does the media's interest in jumping on that next hot social media buzz story, the pylon, does it lead us to ultimately force people to censor ourselves? Now, obviously, all of our research was done before this jackass arrived on the scene because he doesn't care, right? It's not, he will post anything and everything on social media. And say what you will about Mr. Trump, the guy has done a brilliant job of using social media and driving discourse in his own way, like it or not, by dominating the conversation and using it, as a weapon. And he's done a really, really excellent job. So let's talk about the public's perception of the value, right? So I asked the question about the previous comment about censorship. Take a look at this number. I am likely to censor or tone down my personal opinions on social media. 67% said yes. Do you guys do that? Are you careful about what you say? Why? I'm really curious. Why? Sir?
Kind of a changed society now. Like if you're not politically correct, then like everyone will attack you.
Okay. Do you guys agree with that? Is it about political correctness?
Well, for me, I personally tone down my personal opinions because I'm a journalist and my opinion is commentary, not journalism.
Ooh. That is a very, very, very good statement. Yes, there.
If I share something, like let's say anywhere, I don't want to deal with people trying to argue through the comments. I don't like arguing online with people. I don't think it's worth it.
Okay. Lauren?
I don't want like a future employer to see it and like disagree with my opinion and be like, I'm not hiring this girl. I'm trying to get a job in a couple months.
So, yes, a lot of seniors in the room, I'm gathering. So Lauren brings up a really interesting point, just a little side commentary on that. This is becoming a major legal debate, not just a debate about, social media and commentary and sort of what it leads to do. Because, yeah, I mean, employers do check you out. If your settings are public, they look at you on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and others. But now it's becoming a question around the legal ethics behind that. Because if you said something, if you said Donald Trump for president, and you're coming for a job interview with my firm, and I look at that, and I go, we're not hiring that girl. Like, that's illegal. That's wrong, right? We can't do that. Shouldn't be able to do that, right? And it leads, again, to that question of censorship. So going back to the very first statement we began with, right? It promotes more and better public discourse, civic engagement, discussion. Y'all are kind of agreeing with the 67% that says, well, but I censor my real opinions. We're not all Donald Trump who will say whatever he thinks, right? What about voting? So let's take a look at this real quick. Does social media have a greater, the same, or less impact on bringing about change than voting? 16% greater, 34% the same, 40% less. Here's where this gets interesting. 50%, if you put these two bars together, say that social media has as much or more impact at bringing about change than voting. Let's take a listen to why someone in our focus group said that was the case.
So I'm pretty sure that the approval rating of Congress now is pretty much the same as it was 4 years ago.
Or probably lower.
Probably lower. Yet, we all voted, or at least most people that voted for them voted for them. So if you vote the people in, why doesn't the approval change?
So
That's the way.
When you say that, what are you thinking about, right? What's the question you're asking there?
So you asked if you believe that social media has a greater impact on changing things as opposed to voting. And I'm saying that I think it would be conservative to say that voting somebody else in to fill someone else's spot isn't going to provide any greater approval than what impact something on social media might have.
Okay.
So you may have the same people who have similar views as you sitting in an elected office, but they're going to shift their tune based on what's going on. And so if they're just not going to do anything, they're going to get booted out. But ultimately, it's a progressive structure that they're in. It's not something where they're just set and they're just going to stick to it. Because if they did that, then they'd never get reelected again. But our approval of them remains the same. That's what I find funny, is that they can maintain a really, really low approval rating. We can always think, oh, nothing ever gets done. But when it comes to certain social issues or things like that, we look more at the social movements as opposed to necessarily what's in legislation. I mean, the only major legislation that I observe is having impact is Supreme Court rulings.
So he has a very long statement, and it's kind of a complicated point that he's making. But just looking at the clock, and in the interest of time, let me summarize it, which is, this is the debate that's happening right now at the national level, right? You know, the anger that we see in certain factions of the electorate who are angry at the system, right? The two-party system, and are saying, every time you vote for a Democrat, every time you vote for a Republican, doesn't matter. They are ultimately the same, right? So what he's saying is, it really doesn't matter who gets voted into office. It's about the pressure that I can apply on the system in those 4-6-year terms to make things happen, to tell them, I care about this issue. I want to talk about healthcare. I want to talk about this. Is essentially what he is saying, which explains the numbers, right? So if you just look at the number, people think that social media is better than voting. What? That's kind of crazy. But that's ultimately the point that he's making. Yes?
I would say that especially with social media, it's good for spreading awareness, but it's kind of a form of slacktivism. Like, you put out your opinion and you make like a broad statement, and maybe you like tweet about feminism and you're like, okay, that's my social justice action for the day, but you're kind of just posting on Twitter and you're not really doing anything to like make the world a better place.
Did everybody hear that word, slacktivism? You guys know what that word means in the context of social? There's and I just have to tell this part as well. I want to get to my very last section here in a second. There's a great study that was done by a collaborative of researchers in, I believe it was Scandinavia. I'm forgetting the country, that looked at behavioral connections between people that share values, beliefs, opinions on social media and their actual willingness to go out and do things, vote, donate to a cause, volunteer, etc., compared to those that don't share those views and values and beliefs and opinions on social media. Who do you think goes out and votes and volunteers more? The people that aren't telling everybody on Facebook how awesome they are. They actually did a behavioral ethnographic study that looked at this. So slacktivism comes from it's Ice Bucket Challenge. Look, I care so much about diseases and ALS, and I want us to have a cure. But did you donate? Did you do something to help someone, right? And that's not to criticize those people. It's just to say we have this interesting behavioral dichotomy that we're starting to see as the adoption of these channels becomes more prevalent. So this last section's a really important one, and good for you. I only have a couple data points on it because it's a really complex topic. So I talked in the beginning about the issue of race and social media and the value that different racial groups will place on social media. So a really important question, and this is a big one. I think everyone in this room should, I know it's the very end of a long discussion, but pay attention to this one because there's a huge opportunity for you budding journalists and researchers and communication strategists to really take a bite out of this issue. It's tremendously understudied. But how does one's race influence their perceptions of social media's value? So if you look at the 43% agree with the statement, yes, social media is how I get information about what's happening in my community. That's a data point we looked at earlier. Of that 43% that agree with that, 41% are white, 52% are not. It's statistically significant. Now, is this the end of the declaration? Mic drop. Yep, we've proven that African Americans and Latinos value it differently. No. Very small population size, but we noticed this. We started looking at the trends in the national data, and it turns out that, Latinos and African Americans and others, there's a really great study that was done, I believe, by Pew on the national level. They are more likely to use social media for information about what's happening in their ethnic community, in their local community, because they feel that MSNBC and CNN aren't talking about it, right? Crime, poverty, education, public health, those issues, compared to white populations, sorry guys for white folks in the room, celebrities, events, cultural, pop culture, those are the things that we're using it for when it comes to news. The censorship question. Now I'm going to throw some statistics up, and let me begin by saying when you're talking about different ethnic populations and you're having folks self-identify, self-report their ethnicity, you end up with a number larger than 100%. Why? Because people don't just identify as African American, Hispanic, some identify as both. So you're going to see some numbers, you're going to go, what? You don't know how to do math, you communications guy. So of those that say, yes, I'm likely to censor my opinion in what I post, the 67%, 69% were white, 46% non-white. Right? All those different ethnic groups. I'm not going to censor my opinion. If I feel that my community is being persecuted, if I feel that we're being neglected, if I feel we're being undervalued, look at what's happening in Flint, Michigan right now. Right? There's a community that has been dying to have its story told and heard. And it wasn't until a lot of bad things happened that they had that opportunity. So we're at exactly an hour. I encourage you, if you're interested in this, there's 50 pages of information about this topic in our report. Here's the URL. I encourage you guys that really want to fall asleep fast to print it out and read it later. It goes into a lot more depth, but let me leave you with this. I promised Damien that I would flag some issues related to this that are enormously understudied. So we could only do so much in our analysis of this. And as Amy Mitchell from Pew, who I shared with you earlier, said, we're only at the beginning of trying to understand this. But here are some things that need more analysis and examination. So the real influences, behaviors, and values of specific racial and ethnic groups using social media, right? Our research, not sufficient. I will be the first to say that. No one's done it. It's hard to do, but it has not been done. So those award-winning journalists in the room that are really looking for something to sink your teeth into, there's a great research project for you. A real ethnographic study that tracks public perceptions of big social and political issues over time in real time, right? So we did what's called self-reporting. I ask you a question. Did something change your opinion? Yes, no. No. Yes, right? As opposed to looking at something in real time, tracking behaviors, watching a population's perceptions, opinions, values shift. Kind of like our friend in the focus group that talked about, I was against gay marriage and now I'm sort of not against gay marriage, right? So being able to do that and really quantify that is a huge opportunity. Looking at the connections between our digital social actions and real world behaviors, that is the comment about slacktivism. Is slacktivism a real thing? Where does it happen? When does it happen? Which populations does it happen amongst? And then lastly, has the use of social media for journalism, has it altered the accuracy, authenticity, and quality of journalism? Big, huge questions that need continued study and deliberation and discussion. So I encourage all of you to continue to talk about this and look into it and read about it, because there's still work to do, and it's all changing rapidly. So I know I'm a few minutes over. and everyone seems like they're still awake. I don't see, nope, nobody. I see some people checking social media, but thank you guys. And do we have time for any questions? I know we've been asking questions as we go, but.
Let's take a couple of questions, and then also a reminder that outside we have coffee and cupcakes and cookies, all things we can even see. And Zach will be around for a while, so if you want to chat more with him and also refresh your sugary stuff, please do. But before you get up and move, a couple of time for 2 quick questions. Anybody have any?
What is the best way for people to learn how to do strategic social media evaluations like this?
Wow. What is the best way?
Or any tips for anyone in the room who wants to do that?
So what is the best way to study topics like this?
Or just a little bit of self-education, getting started.
Getting started, yeah.
To help supplement what we can learn here through classes like what Kelly teaches.
Yeah, good question. Great question. Not an easy one to answer, but I'll do my best. So anyone that's interested in doing a project like this, here's what we did. We did a lot of literature reviews. So we looked at tons of studies that were out there. Because the one thing we did not want to do is come back and report on things that people already had reported on. And if we did do that, we wanted to do it in the context of trying to localize it, right? So how is this issue around, slacktivism, how is it playing out in Oregon? So lots of literature review, looking at studies and data. The second is, we did polling, online polling, phone surveys, asking people the questions I showed here today, and then we did focus groups. That's just one way to do it. I would say the more interesting, innovative, cutting edge, fascinating way to do it is to actually go in and study populations over long periods of time. Take an issue. Go to this would be fascinating to do. Go to a conservative community in Texas or Mississippi, wherever, and monitor public discourse about a social issue over time. Look at the platforms they use. Do older people use Facebook more, Twitter, et cetera? Look at the chatter that takes place, where the information sources are coming from. And just like you heard in the focus group clip, watch what happens. And that would be a fascinating study. It just takes money and many years to do that. So.
Okay. One more quick question. Are any on this side of the room? Really desperate to get out and get some fresh air?
I know.
No? Okay.
Friday afternoon. Thank you guys. Thank you so much.